You were telling me about some of the Quaker values, such as honesty and equality. What is another Quaker value?
Simplicity. This is why in the past Quakers wore plain clothing which looked a lot like the way the Amish dress. Quakers generally don't dress that way anymore, but they practice simplicity in many other practical ways. By living simply, Quakers try to emphasize what is important and not allow unimportant worldly things to have undue place in our lives. Quakers have also tended to care a great deal about the environment.
What about pacifism?
Yes, peacemaking is a very important Quaker value. When George Fox was offered a position as a captain in Oliver Cromwell's army, he refused, saying, "I live in the virtue of that life and power that takes away the occasion of all wars." Because of this, he was thrown in prison. Many Quakers have since been imprisoned for refusing to participate in military service. It is thanks to the Quakers that it is possible to declare oneself a conscientious objector. It all goes back to the Quaker idea that God loves all of mankind and is actively involved in every person's life. How can we go to war and kill people who are just as valued in God's eyes as us? We are commanded to love them, not kill them. There is much to say about this. Perhaps we can have a future conversation just on this topic. For now, suffice it to say that Quakers have always been against war and have opposed every war from the 17th through 21st centuries, including the American Revolution, World Wars I and II, Vietnam and Iraq. Quakers have always lobbied for seeking peaceful solutions rather than resorting to violence. If you study history, you find that, in retrospect, the Quakers were right. Most wars have been needless and only produce suffering and misery on all sides. In some cases, individual Quakers have decided to enlist, and that is understood to be a matter of individual conscience, but for the most part Quakers have refused to participate in war. These values, equality, truth, simplicity, and peace, are referred to by Quakers as testimonies. What that means is that Quakers bear testimony to what we believe by the way we live our lives.
Danny, so much of what you are describing sounds very different from other churches I've attended. I've heard that some Quakers aren't even Christians. I've heard that there are Buddhist Quakers and even atheist Quakers. Is that true?
This brings up lots of interesting questions about what makes someone a Christian and what it means to follow Jesus. We should discuss this sometime. As far as friends go, the early Quakers were all devout Christians. It is said that George Fox had practically memorized the Bible. The Quakers described their movement as a revival of primitive Christianity. They saw themselves as followers of Jesus, and believed that it was Jesus himself who taught them, and led them, and was present in their meetings. If you read the writings of the early Quakers, such as the Journal of George Fox, it is undeniable that they were Christians. Many years after the death of Fox and the original Quakers, some meetings began to rely less and less on the Bible and to speak less of Jesus, and more of being led by a generic inner light. This became watered down to the point that it could no longer be called explicitly Christian. The meeting I belong to is definitely Christian, but there is also a freedom to explore together what that means. I think there is also a place for Quaker meetings that are not explicitly Christian. I believe that all who honestly seek spirituality will be drawn closer to God, and liberal Quaker meetings provide a great way for those who are not comfortable with Christianity to still approach and encounter God. Now, I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who is a Christian first and a Quaker second. I imagine that someone involved in a liberal Quaker meeting would be able to give us an entirely different perspective which would give us a better understanding of how they view Jesus. I will say, I have learned a lot from the writings of many so-called liberal Quakers. Perhaps we get too hung up on trying to figure out who is in and who is out with God, and should instead just focus on following Him.
That seems very inclusive.
That's it. Quakers tend to be an inclusive bunch. It makes it a lot easier to be inclusive when you believe that God is already at work in everyone's hearts, and He knows what He's doing. God is an inclusive God. That's the way love is, and God is love. Jesus said that He came to show us what God is like, and look who Jesus hung out with. He spent a lot of time with the people who were not considered acceptable by the religious authorities. Jesus saved his anger for those who considered themselves to be the religious insiders. Jesus didn't like the assumption that certain people were excluded from access to God or beyond the reach of God's love.
You're not trying to say that Jesus was a Quaker, are you?
No. I'm saying that the goal of the Quakers was to follow Jesus, and for most Quakers, it still is.
Okay. Hey, all this talk has made me hungry. Want to get something to eat?
Sure. How about oatmeal?
I'd rather have chocolate.
Good idea.